In the following role-play, we see an imagined session with this client, Peter, offering a glimpse into what happens in psychoanalytic counselling. Vic Sedlak, a psychoanalytic therapist, will be taking the role of the counsellor. He based the scenario on an amalgam of clients.
I'd got a phone call from the GP saying, could you see this man? One thing that came across was that I could tell, I think the GP actually said, that he liked this guy. And that recently appointed academic at the university had come up and had begun to get more and more depressed. And the GP thought that he didn't want to immediately prescribe antidepressants. He thought this guy was sort of struggling with some life issues. He didn't know what they were, but he thought it would be useful, him meeting somebody who would take the kind of in-depth approach to him. I know a little bit about you because Dr. Barnes, your GP, spoke to me briefly, but really today I'd like to hear how you see the situation. Where would you like to start?
I don't know, really. I guess I'm slightly surprised to be here. I'm an academic, just been assigned to a post at university. I've been getting sort of more and more depressed for quite a while now. It's almost to the point where it's a struggle to even go to work is a struggle. And I just kind of always have this sense of like hopelessness and anxiety.
Tell me a little more, tell me how it began.
I guess it was like 4 years ago. I was in Peru, I was doing research out there, and my girlfriend Sarah came out to be with me. She actually came out to live with me for a while because we wanted to make a go of it. And, you know, it was the most beautiful place in the world, really. It was where I wanted to be in my life. And it should have been the happiest time of my life. But I ruined it, really. I spoilt it, or sabotaged it, whatever you want to call it. But and I just couldn't get out of the mood that I was in, and eventually, it became too much for Sarah, and she had to. She came back home because she couldn't handle me anymore. She couldn't stand my moods anymore, like my hopelessness, and now she's with someone else. And I'm just worried that I'm going to sabotage my job, like I've sabotaged that. Like, I'm really worried that my new job's that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. So one might think that there's something of a pattern, you know, that you're in Peru, it's the place you want to be, Sarah comes out to join you. It could have been wonderful, but that's where you kind of go down. And now you've got this job, again, a new opening, an opportunity, and I can see you're worried you're going to get depressed again. Tell me something about your background, you know, your parents. What was it like for you?
So, it's pretty normal upbringing, you know, quite easy. Just mum, dad, younger sister, who is 3 years younger than me.
look as though you're really caught up with something. You look terribly sad.
It's nothing really. From about 12, my dad has been quite ill. And he's got wasting disease, which means he's severely, you know, he can hardly talk anymore and he can't walk. So he's been severely, you know, incapacitated from it.
You said nothing really, and then you described this terrible situation.
Well, we just get on with it, really. Yeah, Mum looks after Dad, and my sister hasn't left home because she wants to, you know, look after Mum and make sure she's okay. So everyone, you know, everyone just gets on with it.
Well, really, you're not getting on with it, are you? You've stumbled, and I imagine it must be very difficult to have left that situation where these three people are having to deal with this terrible situation.
Yeah, it's not generally the case because, you know, Mum's always been so, you know, happy with what I've achieved in my sporting achievements and, you know, my academic achievements. And she is quite open about telling me that, you know, if it wasn't for me, she would find it very hard to carry on. And I guess my dad's illness has always made me want to achieve as much as I can. It's always given me that sort of focus to do the best that I can.
I like having a working hypothesis, as long as you keep remembering it's a hypothesis and might not be right. But my working hypothesis, having met him, was that he was a very depressed man, to the point of almost being retarded. And yet I warmed to him. I could see why the GP liked him. And I thought it was very important that he'd collapsed at the point when things were really going well for him, when he went to Peru, and that he was very frightened that he'd collapse again after another success, actually, getting this academic post. And in my mind, that was very tied up with his history. He tried to make light of it, but actually, you know, just as you're coming into adolescence, when you're 12, you know, you're beginning to develop yourself and your father collapses like that. I think this had a tremendous effect upon him. And so my hypothesis was that he was one of those people who unconsciously felt very guilty about being successful, being a man, being potent. I mean, unconsciously guilty to the point of actually bringing himself down. And I thought he needed some insight into this. The transference, I thought, was very mixed. I think he was hoping to find in me probably the father that he had before the father became ill. You know, a strong support, because I think he must have that in his history. You know, he's done well in life generally. I think he must have had kind of parents who looked after him, you know, decently and properly, and he's internalised them, and it served him well. So I think he was looking for that, you know, based on that's transference. We tend to think if the patient doesn't like us, it's transference. If the patient likes us, it means that they've got a, you know, they're a good judge of character. But actually, both are transference. You know, I think he had some good internal people, and he was transferring them and looking onto me. But I thought he was also very not wary, but questioning. You know, is this guy, me, up to it, or is he going to really let me down? And I mean, one can understand that, but I thought they were both part of the transference. I think my major countertransference, which did inform my hypothesis, I was actually feeling rather paternal towards him. And I thought occasionally he'd sneak glances at me, and I thought he is hoping to find, you know, like a father figure or a helpful figure. And he certainly engaged that part of me. I mean, I really wanted to help him. I mean, for all sorts of reasons, narcissistic reasons and everything else. But I think there was a paternal countertransference, which I tried, obviously, not to act it out. But I think it kind of influenced the rather gentle way I tried to talk to him. You know, I was really trying to engage him because I genuinely wanted to help him.
Perhaps maybe, I don't know what to say, maybe you could ask me questions. I don't know what to say.
This is a very difficult situation for anyone to be in.
Yeah.
But I would really just like you to say whatever comes into your mind.
I don't think this is right for me. This whole thing, I don't think this is sort of working for me. I really appreciate what you're doing, but I don't feel like these sessions, I'm going to get much out of these sessions. I mean, you came very well recommended by my GP, and I really, as I say, do appreciate what you're doing.
I can see you've got, you know, real doubts about this, but let's just try and work out, you know, how your mind works. Just tell me, I mean, you just have now, but tell me more about the things that come into your mind.
I guess I had this dream. This is really corny, this is really cheesy, but I had this dream last night that I was basically approached by my professor, he was wearing this like attire, this really professional attire, and he came up to me, and I couldn't help notice that he had like really filthy shoes, and it's like he'd been walking through like a field of clay, and there was this girl who was really attractive. She was like a colleague, and she was there, and she came up to him as well.
An actual colleague of yours,
yeah.
Is it? Uh-huh.
And she noticed the shoes as well, and it was very important that we both didn't let him know that we'd noticed his filthy shoes. So it's a weird dream, and
What comes to your mind?
I guess I find this colleague that was in the dream, I guess I find her quite attractive, and I know that she's unattached right now. But I saw the professor was looking at her at the meeting we had last week, and I just think like he's old enough to be her father. I'm not saying like that like she can't be with an older man, because like, that's not what I mean. Like, because obviously, I'm not saying he's past it, but yeah, because a lot of older men do end up with younger girls, going out with them and stuff.
I can't help feeling that you got a bit anxious telling me that about that the prof's is, you know, old enough to be your colleague's father. I think you got anxious that I might just kind of take it personally and think, oh, is he telling me that I'm too old? And so I think you're just trying to reassure me a little bit there.
I remember being 12 years old, and I was playing football with my dad. And I remember that it was like an exact moment that I noticed that he was losing his coordination. And I think, it was also, at that moment I realised that he was getting very ill, like that there were the first signs of his illness.
I think that's very important, and I think it links with the dream. I think you have got a real difficulty, you know, with older men who, I mean, to relate it to your dream, you know, might have feet of clay. And it begins with I think your father not being able to coordinate his feet, and, you know, I think you have doubts about me, despite my high reputation, really. You know, have I got feet of clay and won't be able to help you? And I think it's the same with your prof in the dream. I think you're worried that, you know, you're young and active and can do things, and there's these older men with feet of clay.
Maybe. Yeah, well, I guess that's kind of like inevitable, you know, because of what happened to, you know, what's happened to Dad. I guess that is kind of maybe what sometimes it's so hard because I wish things had been different. I wish that he wasn't ill. No, but it's good, but in a way because it's good, because it makes me want to be more, you know, achieve more, and it pushes me further knowing that my dad's ill, and also like the support of my mum, that makes me, you know, that gives me a drive. But it's like, why can't I just enjoy that, you know? And why do I, like this lecture, why am I so scared or worried or terrified that I'm just going to mess it up all the time?
You know, I'm sure what you say is right, that it has given you a drive in your life, that you want to make up for your father's illness and, you know, bring something good into the situation. But I think there's another side to it as well, you know. Also, well, you know, to go back to the dream, there's your colleague who will, you know, in actual fact, she's quite attracted to you and not to the professor. And I think you're worried that if you make a success of things, you kind of outdo and, you know, you compete with the man and do better than him. I think you're worried that if your colleague would prefer you to me, you to the professor, you know, I think it goes back to that early memory as well, that, you're the better footballer. And I think being better, I know it's a good thing, but I think it also comes with all of this baggage which you can't, you know, is really bringing you down, I think.
I suppose so. I'm remembering the day that I first got depressed. Do you want me to tell you about it?
It's coming to your mind, go on.
Well, I was in Peru, and Sarah, the girlfriend that I mentioned, ex-girlfriend, we went hiking. We took a day trip and we went hiking, and we found this ridge, and we climbed the ridge, and we just went to the top and we looked down, and we could like see miles upon miles of countryside and just these beautiful landscapes, and it was the most, you know, beautiful moment. But I just got like really scared about how high up we were, and you know, I got vertigo. I started to become like really frozen with fear, to the point where she had to like, Sarah had to basically help me down. I was like really embarrassed she had to help me. And I never ever suffered from vertigo before.
I think you do get very anxious, you know, when you feel that you could really be sort of on top of the world, on top of things. I know there's a part of you wants to, you know, make a real success of the lecture, but I think that memory is about getting very, very anxious when you're high. I think partly because you're worried that you'll be looking down on people, like your father, your professor, me. And then I think you get incredibly anxious. And I think, you know, you see Sarah helped you down. I think you also want me to help you kind of understand this so that you don't get so anxious about doing well.
I just feel like really guilty about everything that, you know, my life or whatever I have achieved or think I've achieved. When I think about my mum and my sister Rachel, like what they're going through, that's what makes me feel really, I don't know, yeah, whatever the word is.
Well, you use the word guilty. I think that is the right word, you know. So I think you feel guilty, you know, if, for example, I'm in your mind as someone who can't help you, who's a failure, and then you go off and do a really good lecture. I think that would be very difficult for you. I think you want to feel that, you know, someone like me could be strong and that you could be strong as well. I try to create an atmosphere in which the patient might realise that I'm actually interested in hearing what's in his mind, and I'm not going to let him off that difficult task of telling me what's in his mind. So I have different ways of putting it. You know, I can see you're having a thought, or what's in your mind at the moment, or it seems difficult to start, but What are you thinking? The emphasis is on hearing what's in the patient's mind, and then working with that. So, and that also applies to response to interpretation. It's not very, you give an interpretation and the patient says, yes, that's right. It doesn't tell you a lot. But if you give an interpretation, the patient says, I suppose so, and then he remembers something like Peter remembered his father playing football. I mean, I thought that was, so helpful, actually. And because it was a bit like the dream. The dream and that early memory, for me, were the two important parts that really oriented me. Once I'd tried to create a setting in which he could tell me what was in his mind, those two things, and then remembering the beginnings of the first breakdown when they climbed the ridge. I thought they spontaneously came into his mind. Now, I could never have asked him a question that would have elicited those things. So leaving a space and then really taking seriously what the patient says is the way psychoanalytical people work. I gave an interpretation very, very early on when I reflected upon the fact that the breakdown he had and the one that he feared he was having now occurred at points when things had been going very well in his life.
I'm just worried that I'm going to sabotage my job, my new job, like I've sabotaged my relationship with her.
Mm-hmm. So one might think that there's something of a pattern, that you're in Peru, it's the place you want to be, Sarah comes out to join you. It could have been wonderful, but that's where you kind of go down. And now you've got this job, again, a new opening, an opportunity, and I can see you're worried you're going to get depressed again. That, I think, is an interpretation. It's not a transference interpretation, but it's an interpretation, which I don't think he really responded to that well. But nevertheless, it was worth making, because one of the things I was trying to find out is he interested in this way of working? And the best way is to give somebody an interpretation and see how they react. The second interpretation I gave was towards the end of that first session, when I said it must have been very difficult for him to leave this awful family situation and to go off and lead a life of his own.
My sister hasn't left home because she wants to, look after mum and make sure she's okay, so everyone, everyone just gets on with it.
Well, really, you're not getting on with it, are you? You've stumbled, and I imagine it must be very difficult to have left that situation where these three people are having to deal with this terrible situation.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit like a kind of reflection of what I'd heard, but I think it is an interpretation. I'm trying to put to him that there must be a conflict going on inside him. So I think I tend to interpret when I think I can see something that I think the patient might be interested in. I mean, it's not an exact science at all, but I think that is the best way. And if you get it wrong, it doesn't end with... There's a teacher of mine called Hannah Siegel who says an interpretation is just like the serve in a tennis match. It's only the first movement, but then you get a return and then you can play another shot. So interpretation should be seen like that. It's testing a hypothesis and seeing what reaction you get. I can't help feeling that you got a bit anxious telling me that about that the prof's is, old enough to be your colleague's father. I think you got anxious that I might just kind of take it personally and think, oh, is he telling me that I'm too old? And so I think you're just trying to reassure me a little bit there. I do use silence as a means of really informing the patient that I'm very interested in what's going on in their mind. But I also try to be sensitive to it, because I think with some patients, and at times I thought it might be happening with the role play that we saw, that it stops feeling like an opportunity to the patient and begins to feel like a persecution. You know, this bloke isn't going to say something, he's just waiting for me to... And it can get confrontative. And if I feel that the atmosphere is changing, and you can usually tell by the looks or the body language, I will try and diffuse it a little bit by saying something like, I can see it's difficult for you, it's difficult for everybody, but do try to tell me what's in your mind. But I think when, you know, you can overuse silence, it can tip into something rather persecutory.
Mum, Dad, younger sister, who is 3 years younger than me.
You look as though you're really caught up with something terribly sad.
It's nothing really. From about 12, my dad has been quite ill.
I was interested in two different types of relationship, of forming two different types of relationship with the client. One was trying to look at the relationship he formed with me. And I thought we could see in that session that the relationship he formed with me was one of anxiety, that I might have feet of clay, you know, that I was going to collapse, and that he'd be the strong man who his colleague chose. So, and I thought that was very important to clarify that relationship. But then when I interpret, I'm trying to shift the relationship, and I'm trying to have, I'm sort of saying to him, look, I think this is the relationship we've formed, but can we step aside and have a look at the relationship we've formed? Now, I think that's a therapeutic relationship that runs alongside the transference relationship. And both are very, very important, because if you just have the therapeutic relationship, you end up in a very academic sort of thing.
I remember being 12 years old, and I was playing football with my dad. And I remember that it was like an exact moment that I noticed that he was losing his coordination.
I think you have got a real difficulty, you know, with older men who, I mean, to relate it to your dream, you know, might have feet of clay. And it begins with I think your father not being able to coordinate his feet, and you know, I think you have doubts about me, despite my high reputation, really. You know, have I got feet of clay and won't be able to help you? And I think it's the same with your prof in the dream. I think you're worried that, you know, you're young and active and can do things, and there's these older men with feet of clay. It's to do with the theory of change, that some approaches believe that if you can provide a therapeutic relationship, if you can be warm, or in this case, the case we've looked at, if you could show him that you weren't going to collapse, that you were a strong man, there is a theory that that would be helpful. It's called the theory of the corrective emotional experience, that the therapist provides an experience that the patient didn't have before. Now, I don't think that's actually that helpful. I think the helpful thing is to help the patient realise that they've got an internal world, a way of viewing things that dominates their view of the world. So you don't say, I think you fear that I'm going to collapse, but really I'm not going to collapse. You say, I think you're very frightened, that you've got to keep reassuring me in case I collapse. Now, implicit in that is, look, I can take your anxiety about me, but you're not sort of saying, I'm not going to collapse. You're just doing your work. And I think the theory of change there is one based on insight.
I just feel like really guilty about evidence that, you know, my life or whatever I have achieved or think I've achieved. When I think about my mum and my sister Rachel, like what they're going through, that's what makes me feel really, I don't know, yeah, whatever the word is.
I think you've put your finger on something very important, actually, which is, I think you do feel very guilty. Guilty about situations where you're doing well and, you know, the others aren't. And I mean, for example, with us, I think you'd feel guilty if you did a really good lecture and had me in your mind as someone, you know, who isn't doing a good job. I think it's that sort of constellation that you're always struggling with.
In these first 2 sessions, the client has begun to make conscious aspects of his internal world. Client and therapist might meet for another 15 to 20 sessions to work through the emerging material, which ideally will help the client to develop a deeper understanding of inner conflicts and dilemmas.